Jesus was a revolutionary. In Jesus' day, there were Jews and there were Gentiles. Jews were clean, Gentiles were unclean. This goes right back to the law of Moses, the whole way that Israelite society and religion was ordered. There are those who are clean and there are those who are unclean. Now, Israel was living under Roman occupation, under Roman oppression. And so the idea of unclean Gentiles took on a whole new meaning, because they weren't just unclean because they didn't do the right religious stuff. They weren't just unclean because they didn't eat the right food. They were unclean because they weren't supposed to be there. This was Israel's land, and now the Gentiles were here too. In our series on Matthew, we're in chapter 8, and we're on a mountainside coming down after Jesus' famous sermon. And the first person that Jesus meets is a man who has leprosy. Leprosy affects the skin. And people who had leprosy at the time of Jesus were considered so unclean that they were cast out of the community. They were literally called the untouchables. And Jesus walks down the mountain and he meets this man who has leprosy. And this guy kneels before him and says, "Teacher, if you're willing, you can make me well." And Jesus reaches out his hand and he touches the man. And immediately the man is healed. And then Jesus meets a Roman centurion, a commander of armies in the Roman Empire. And the centurion says to Jesus, "Teacher, my servant is ill. You just say the word and he will be healed." And Jesus says, "I'll tell you what, I have not found faith like this in the whole of Israel. Many will come from the east and the west and take their place at the feast of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth." You see, the Jews had this idea that when the revolution came, when the Romans were overthrown and the kingdom of God was established in Jerusalem, that there would be a feast, the feast of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And all of the Jews would be gathered in from around the countries in which they were scattered, and they would come to Jerusalem and take their place at this feast. And all the Gentile nations would come and bow and worship Yahweh in his temple on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And here is a man who symbolizes all of Israel's oppression, this Roman centurion. And Jesus reaches out and heals his servant. And Jesus praises him for greater faith even than that he had found in Israel, and suggests that those who are coming to the feast might not be those who had expected to take their place. The warning is clear to the Jews: don't get complacent that you'll be in, or you might be out. Jesus touches the most unclean, untouchable. And Jesus heals the servant of the Gentile enemy. This revolution is one in which Jesus crosses the divide. And so we move on later in Matthew's Gospel to chapter 15, and Jesus goes up another mountain, and a large crowd are with him, and he teaches them. And the disciples come to him and say, "Teacher, let these people go home. They've been here for days, they're hungry, they need to find something to eat." And Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." So the disciples look around. I mean, there's 5,000 men here, plus women and children. And they find a boy who has a packed lunch with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And they bring them to Jesus, and Jesus prays and gives thanks for them. And then they hand out the food to all the people there, and everyone has enough to eat. And the disciples gather in 12 baskets of leftovers. It's an amazing miracle. And then later, Jesus goes further north into the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is Gentile country. And he goes up a mountain and he's teaching a crowd for days. And they get hungry, and the disciples say to Jesus, Jesus, send these people away to go and get some food. And Jesus says, you find them something to eat. This time there are 4,000 men, not to mention women and children. And you can imagine the disciples' brains whirring, thinking, where is that kid with the packed lunch? And they find him, and they bring the bread and the fish to Jesus, and Jesus gives thanks, and he distributes the bread and the fish to all the people, and everyone has enough to eat. And the disciples collect 7 baskets of what is left over. And then at the end of our scene in chapter 16, Jesus is in the boat with his disciples. And he's pretty much banging his head against the side, saying, do you not understand the meaning of the 5,000 and the 4,000? Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What does he mean? Well, what we've got to understand is that for Jews, still now, but particularly at the time of Jesus, numbers were a really big deal. They got really emotional about numbers. And 12 is a very emotional number. The number of baskets collected after Jesus feeds 5,000 men. 12. The number of the tribes of Israel. The number that symbolizes the gathering in of Israel at the coming of the kingdom of God. When the disciples gather up 12 baskets, no Jewish reader could fail to understand that this symbolizes the gathering in of Israel to the feast of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But then there's 7. 7 is a really emotional number as well. 7 is the number of days it took for God to create the world. 7 is a number that symbolizes everyone. So when the disciples gather in 7 baskets, it is a powerful, provocative symbol that God is bringing in not just the Jews, but the Gentiles as well. Everybody is welcome in God's new kingdom. The yeast of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees is this religious nationalism that says the Jews are in, the Gentiles are out. The Jews are clean, the Gentiles are unclean. In Jesus' revolution, in the kingdom of God, there is no division. Jesus' revolution breaks down the divide. It smashes the boundaries and welcomes in everybody. Doesn't matter your race or your religion. Doesn't matter who you are. You are welcome in Jesus' kingdom. And so the question is, are you in on this revolution? Will you be part of Jesus' revolution? Will you cross the divide?